"You're coming home with me tonight." The words hit Charlotte like a slap, quiet, certain, and spoken in front of every man in that saloon who had just watched Gus McCready grab her wrist and call her a thieving whore. Nobody had moved. Nobody had breathed. And now this stranger, this tall, stone-faced man with cold eyes and a reputation that made grown cowhands step aside, was standing between her and the worst night of her life. And she didn't know whether to thank him or run. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart beating faster, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow along until the very last word. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Charlotte Bennett had learned early that the world did not extend grace to women who needed it most. She had learned it the first time her father lost a season's wages to a card game and came home smelling of whiskey and shame. She had learned it again when the schoolmaster in Laramie told her that girls like her, poor girls, plain girls, girls with mud on their boots, and no family name worth mentioning, had no business sitting in the same room as the merchant's daughters. She had learned it every single day of the 3 years since her father died, and left her with nothing but a name nobody respected, and a body that men felt entitled to comment on whenever she walked past. At 28. Charlotte Bennett was not a woman the world had been kind to. But she was still standing, and that she had decided a long time ago had to count for something. She worked in Caldwell Springs, Wyoming Territory, in the summer of 1889, a railroad town that smelled of coal smoke and ambition, and the particular desperation of men who had come west looking for a second chance and found only hard ground and harder winters. She washed laundry for the boarding house. She cooked breakfast for the travelers who came through on the Union Pacific line. She mended shirts for cowhands who paid her in coin when they remembered and in promises when they didn't. It was not a glamorous life, but it was hers. The trouble with Gus McCready had been building for 6 weeks. Gus owned the largest cattle operation east of Cheyenne, or he liked to say he did, though everyone in Caldwell Springs knew the bank held the majority of his notes and his temper was inversely proportional to his solvency. He had hired Charlotte to cook for his crew during the branding season. 12 men, 3 meals a day, 42 days straight. She had done it without complaint. She had done it well. And when the season ended, Gus had smiled his wide, greasy smile and told her he'd settle up on Friday. Friday came, then another Friday, then 4 more. Gus. She had stopped him outside the general store that morning, her voice steady and her chin up. 6 weeks. You owe me 6 weeks of wages. Do I? He had looked at her, the men like him looked at women like her, as though she were a minor inconvenience, like a fly on a Sunday dinner table. Way I recall it, the biscuits were dry the last week. I figure that squares us. The biscuits were fine, and you know it. You calling me a liar, Charlotte? She had not answered that. She had made a tactical decision to wait until evening, when the full crew gathered at the Double Spur Saloon for their Friday drinks, and she had walked in through the front door, which women of her station were not supposed to do, and she had asked him one more time in front of witnesses, because she had learned that men like Gus McCready only felt shame when they had an audience. She had not anticipated how badly it would go wrong. The Double Spur was crowded. Cowboys and railroad men and 2 land speculators who had ridden up from Denver, sitting near the back with their fine coats and their careful eyes. The piano player had stopped when she walked in. 30-odd men had turned to look at her. Charlotte. Gus's voice had carried a warning in it. This is not the place. Then pay me what you owe, and I'll leave. He had moved fast for a big man. He grabbed her wrist, the left one, the smaller one, and the grip was tight enough that she felt something grind. She had not cried out. She had learned not to cry out. You listen to me, he said low and ugly close to her ear. You come in here making noise in front of my men. I'll make sure every outfit between here and Cheyenne knows your trouble. You'll be washing dishes in a brothel before Christmas. The saloon was absolutely silent. Not one man moved. Not the bartender. Not the cowhands who'd eaten her cooking for 6 weeks and told her it was the best meal they'd had since their mother's tables. Not the 2 railroad men who prided themselves on being civilized. Nobody. Charlotte felt the particular loneliness of that silence, the way she felt cold, not just on the surface, but all the way down through the bone. This was the world. This was how it worked. And there was nothing she could do about it. And then a chair scraped. Slowly. Deliberately. The kind of sound that made every head turn because it carried the weight of intention behind it. The man who stood up was not the largest man in the room, though he was tall. He was not the loudest, he hadn't said a word yet. But something about the way he rose from that chair, unhurried and absolute, made Gus McCready's hand loosen on Charlotte's wrist, before either of them had consciously registered what was happening. She had seen Wade Harper before. Everyone in Caldwell Springs had seen Wade Harper, had seen him ride through on that black horse, had seen him at the land office, had seen him at the assay counter, conducting business in the clipped, precise way of a man who had no interest in small talk or social niceties. Harper Ridge Ranch was 40 miles north. By every account she had ever heard, the man was wealthy, cold fare to his workers, and entirely uninterested in the affairs of anyone outside his own fence line. He crossed the room without hurrying, stopped in front of Gus McCready, looked at him for a moment, just looked with those pale gray eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everything they landed on, and then reached into his coat pocket and laid money on the bar. Exact money. The correct amount, as though he had calculated it before he stood up. 6 weeks, Wade said. His voice was quiet. The room heard every word. 42 days, 3 meals, 12 men. He looked at Gus. Your math seems to have failed you. Gus stared at the money. This isn't your business, Harper. I'm making it my business. He said it without heat, without drama. It was a statement of fact, delivered the way you'd tell a man the weather. And somehow, that was worse for Gus, worse for the tension in the room, than if Wade had shouted it. Gus released her wrist. Charlotte stood very still. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. She wanted to reach for the money on the bar. She also wanted to say that she didn't need his help. Thank you. She had been handling men like Gus McCready her entire adult life. She said neither of these things because her wrist was throbbing, and she was trying very hard not to show it. Wade turned to look at her then. His eyes went straight to her wrist, the way it hung at her side, the way she was holding it careful and close without quite realizing she was doing it. His jaw tightened. How long has he been doing that? He asked. Not to Gus, to her. I'm fine, she said. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The room looked at both of them. Someone coughed near the back. Long enough, she said finally, because she was tired. Tired of the whole performance of pretending things were fine when they manifestly were not. Tired of carrying the weight of other people's ugliness as though it belonged to her. Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't have named it exactly. It wasn't pity. She knew what pity looked like, had seen it her whole life, had learned to hate it with a clean and specific hatred. This was something else, something older and more complicated. You're coming home with me tonight, Wade Harper said. The saloon erupted, not loudly. This was Wyoming Territory. Not a theater, but in the dozens of small ways that men express shock when they can't quite bring themselves to be loud about it. The intake of breath, the exchange of glances, the barely suppressed murmur that ran through the room like water finding its level. Gus McCready's face went through several colors in rapid succession. Charlotte felt the blood rise in her own face. Excuse me, I have a ranch 40 miles north, Wade said. His voice hadn't changed at all, same quiet, same certainty. I need a housekeeper. My last one left in April. The position pays fair wages, paid on time every Friday. He looked at her steadily. You'll have your own room, your own space. Nobody will put their hands on you. The silence that followed was different from the first silence. The first had been the silence of men choosing not to act. This one was the silence of men trying to understand what they were witnessing. Charlotte studied his face, looking for the angle. There was always an angle. She had 28 years of evidence. Why? She said. Because I need a housekeeper, and you need a position. He said it like it was simple, like the math was obvious, and only a fool would complicate it. And because Gus McCready has been running up debts all over this county, and sooner or later someone was going to make him account for one of them. Tonight, that someone is me. He picked up the money from the bar and held it out to her. "Your wages, earned and owed." She took it. Her hand was steadier than she expected. "I'll need a day," she said, "to collect my things." "I'll be at the livery stable tomorrow morning at 7, he said. "If you're there, we ride north. If you're not, I understand." He nodded a short final nod, the kind that closed a negotiation, and walked back to his table, sat down and picked up his coffee, as though nothing of particular significance had occurred. The piano started again sometime after that, but Charlotte didn't notice. She was already calculating. She was at the livery stable at 6:45. She had lain awake most of the night arguing with herself, listing every reason. This was a foolish idea. She knew nothing about this man, knew nothing about his ranch, knew nothing about what housekeeper actually meant in his lexicon, and then listing the counter-arguments, which were simpler and more powerful. She had $12, no family, and Gus McCready had just made it clear that her time in Caldwell Springs was running out. Wade Harper arrived at 7 exactly. He had 2 horses, the black one he rode, and a brown mare loaded with saddlebags. He looked at her single bag, the one she'd packed everything she owned into, and he didn't say anything about its size or its worn leather strap, or the fact that it was held together in one corner with a piece of wire. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. And they rode north. They didn't talk much for the first hour. The silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had expected it to be the heavy kind of silence, the kind men use to remind women of their place in the social order. But it wasn't. It was just quiet. The kind of quiet that meant neither of them felt the need to perform. "How long were you in Caldwell Springs?" he asked eventually. 14 months. "Before that, Laramie. Before that, a place called Tanner's Crossing. Before that, Cheyenne." She paused. "I go where the work is." He nodded. "Family?" No. He didn't offer condolences. She appreciated that. "The work at Harper Ridge is real work," he said. "The house is large. There are 15 hands who take meals in the bunkhouse. I take meals alone in the house usually. There's a kitchen garden that's gotten away from us since April. Records need organization. It's not easy." "I'm not looking for easy," she said. He glanced at her sideways. The corner of his mouth moved almost. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to acknowledgement. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you are." Harper Ridge was not what she had expected. She had expected grandeur, the kind of performative wealth that men like Wade Harper were supposed to display, the kind that said, "I have arrived, and I need you to know it." She had expected a house built to impress, rather than to live in. What she found was a house that had once been beautiful, and was now simply large and tired and a little bit sad. The kitchen had a wood stove that someone had neglected for weeks, she could tell by the buildup in the flue. The pantry was stocked with dry goods in quantities that suggested a cook who cared about provision, but the organizational system had collapsed entirely. Cans and sacks and jars, arranged by no principle she could identify. The main room had good furniture, heavy and solid, but dusty. The windows let in strong prairie light, but hadn't been washed in months. It was not a house. It was a building where a man lived alone, and had slowly stopped noticing what that looked like. She set her bag down in the room. He showed her a clean room, south-facing with a window that overlooked the kitchen garden. And she stood at that window for a moment, looking at what had been neglected, and she made a list in her mind. Not a list of complaints. A list of what could be fixed. Wade appeared in the doorway. "I'll show you where things are kept." "All right. Meals for the hands are at 6, noon, and 7. I take my own at 6:30, noon 30, and 7:30. We have a cook for the bunkhouse, a man named Pete, but he handles his own kitchen. Your job is the main house." "And the records you mentioned." Something moved in his expression. Surprise maybe that she had held on to that detail. "The ranch accounts. Previous housekeeper kept them organized. It's..." He paused. "Fallen behind." "I can do accounts," she said. "You've done accounts before." "My father was a supply merchant for 10 years before the business failed. I kept his books from the time I was 14. She said it simply without apology or emphasis. It was a fact. I can read, I can write, and I'm better than average at arithmetic. If that changes the terms of the position, I'd like to know now." He looked at her for a long moment. And there it was again, that thing she couldn't name, that wasn't pity. "It doesn't change the terms," he said. "It improves them." The first week she learned the house. The second week she learned the rhythms of the ranch, who rode out at what hour, who returned early, who lingered at the barn, who carried old injuries that slowed them down. It was on a Thursday of the second week that she first encountered the situation with Billy Crane. Billy was 16, the youngest hand on the ranch, and he'd been working through a shoulder injury for 3 weeks without telling anyone, because he was terrified of being let go. She figured it out because of the way he held his coffee cup favoring his right hand when his left was the dominant one, which meant the left hurt badly enough that he'd learned to compensate without realizing she was watching. She said nothing at breakfast, but she found the ranch's medical kit a decent one, well-stocked, which told her something about Wade Harper, and she put together a compress and a proper sling, and after dinner she caught Billy alone near the pump. "Sit down," she said. He stared at her. "Ma'am, your shoulder. Sit down. I'm not going to tell anyone." She paused. "Unless you make me watch you carry another full water barrel with a separated muscle, in which case I'll have something to say to Mr. Harper." He sat down. She worked on the shoulder carefully, correctly, because she had learned some medicine out of necessity during the years her father had been too sick to see a proper doctor and too proud to ask for help. Billy hissed in pain twice and bit down on his lip and didn't make another sound. "How long?" she asked. 3 weeks, he admitted. "You should have said something." "I need this job, ma'am. My mother's in Laramie. I send money home." She tied off the sling with a quiet efficiency. "Mr. Harper isn't going to let you go for being injured," she said. Not with absolute certainty. She didn't know Wade Harper well enough for that yet, but with enough confidence that Billy's shoulders came down slightly from around his ears. "You don't know that," the boy said. "No," she admitted. "But I'll talk to him. And if he's the man I think he is, you'll be fine." She did talk to him. That evening after dinner, when Wade was in his office with the account books spread across the desk and his coffee going cold the way it always did when he was reading figures. "Billy Crane has a separated shoulder," she said from the doorway. "He's been hiding it for 3 weeks because he's afraid of losing his position. He needs a week of light work, and then he'll be fine." Wade set down his pen, looked at her. "How did you know?" The way he was holding his cup. A pause. "A week of light work," he repeated. "Fence mending. Anything that keeps him moving without putting strain on the joint." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tell Pete to add extra meat to the boys' supper for the next week. He needs it." She turned to leave. "Miss Bennett." She stopped. "Thank you," he said. He said it like he meant it in the same straightforward, unadorned way. He said everything else. There was no performance to it, no social grace layered on top, just the words accurate and sincere. She nodded and went back to her kitchen. That night, lying awake with the prairie wind moving through her window, she thought about the fact that she had not spent a single night afraid since she arrived at Harper Ridge. Had not gone to sleep calculating exits and worst-case scenarios, the way she had in every rooming house, every temporary position, every town that had never quite felt like it would let her stay. She didn't know what to do with that, so she made a note of it, the way she made notes of everything. Filed it carefully in the back of her mind, where she kept the things she wasn't ready to examine yet, and went to sleep. 3 weeks into her time at Harper Ridge, Charlotte found the ledger. She had been reorganizing the ranch office with Wade's permission, and his mild astonishment that she was doing it systematically, rather than simply shifting the clutter from one surface to another, and behind a loose board in the lower cabinet, tucked behind a box of old correspondence, she found a ledger that was not like the ranch's other account books. It was older. The handwriting inside was not Wade's. It was careful and feminine, which meant it predated the current system, which meant it belonged to someone who had kept records here before the previous housekeeper, maybe years before. She opened it. The first entries were straightforward. Supply purchases, wage records, standard ranch accounting. But 40 pages in the entries changed. Names she recognized not from Wade's books, but from town. Family names she had heard mentioned in Caldwell Springs. Widows' names. Names of small landholders who had sold their claims years ago and disappeared from the county. And next to those names in a different hand. Harder, faster. The handwriting of a man who wrote quickly because he was confident no one would examine what he was writing. Were numbers. Contract terms. Conditions that were not part of any legitimate land purchase she had ever seen. She sat with the ledger open in her lap for a long time. She knew that handwriting. She had seen it in Caldwell Springs. She had seen it in the offices of a man named Victor Langford, who was the largest land speculator in the county and the most well-connected, and who had been Gus McCready's business partner before some falling out nobody quite understood. She didn't fully understand yet what she was looking at, but she understood enough to know that it was dangerous. And she understood with the cold, clear certainty of someone who had spent 28 years learning to read the difference between coincidence and pattern, that bringing this into the open would require more than she currently had. It would require evidence, time, and someone who had enough standing in this county that people would be compelled to listen. She closed the ledger. She did not say anything to Wade that evening, or the next day. She filed the information, the way she filed everything that frightened her, carefully, correctly in the back of her mind, and she went back to work. Because the work was what she had. It was what she knew how to do. And whatever was coming, she would face it better from a position of readiness than from one of panic. Outside, the last light was gold across the Wyoming grasslands, and somewhere in the bunkhouse, Billy Crane was eating a proper supper for the first time in weeks, and Pete the cook was laughing about something that carried all the way to the main house on the evening wind. And Charlotte Bennett, who had never had a home and had stopped believing she deserved one, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, going cold in her hands, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that for the first time in her adult life, she didn't want to leave. The ledger stayed hidden for 4 more days. Charlotte told herself she was waiting until she understood it better, until she had read every page, cross-referenced every name, built a complete picture before she said a word to anyone. That was the practical reason. The honest, the one she admitted only in the small hours of the night when the ranch was quiet, and there was nothing to distract her from her own thoughts, was simpler and less flattering. She was afraid. Not of Victor Langford. Not yet. Anyway, he was a threat at a distance, a name in old ink, a problem she hadn't fully defined. What she was afraid of was something closer and more immediate. She was afraid that the moment she brought this to Wade Harper, everything would change. The careful equilibrium she had found in her first weeks at Harper Ridge, the work, the rhythm, the first real stillness she had known in years, would shatter, and she would be back to being the woman that trouble followed the woman. Nobody could afford to keep the woman. The world moved around because keeping her close cost too much. So she kept working, and she kept watching, and on the 4th day, Wade Harper made it impossible to keep doing either. He came into the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, which was unusual. He normally didn't appear until she had breakfast on the table, and he sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which was also unusual, and he put both hands flat on the surface and looked at her with those gray eyes that missed very little. "You found something," he said. Charlotte set down the skillet, turned to face him. "What makes you say that?" "Because you've been quiet in a different way for the past 4 days. There's regular quiet, and there's careful quiet, and you've been doing the second one." He paused. "And because I noticed the cabinet in the office has been reorganized, and there's a space behind the lower panel that looks like it was recently disturbed." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went to the bedroom, retrieved the ledger from under the loose floorboard where she'd moved it, because one hiding place was never enough. That was a lesson learned young, and brought it back to the kitchen and set it on the table in front of him. He opened it. She watched his face as he read. Wade Harper had a face built for concealment. She had understood that from the first day, the kind of face that gave very little away, that had learned through long practice to keep its interior weather from showing on the surface. But as he turned the pages, something happened underneath that control. A tightening around his eyes. A stillness in his jaw that was different from his usual stillness, harder, colder, the stillness of a man holding himself very deliberately together. He read for 11 minutes. She counted because she had nothing else to do with her hands, and counting gave them purpose. "Victor Langford," he said finally. "You know him." "I know of him. Every rancher in this territory knows of him. He's been buying up land along the Platte Basin for 6 years." He turned another page. "These names, these families. I recognized some of them from Caldwell Springs, widows, small landowners, the kind of people who wouldn't know a fraudulent contract clause if it was explained to them in plain language." "Where did you see his handwriting before?" She told him about Caldwell Springs, about the office she had passed twice a week delivering laundry, about the door that was always open in summer, because Langford ran warm about the documents she had seen spread across the desk that she hadn't understood at the time were worth understanding. Wade closed the ledger. "This was hidden in my own office, behind the lower cabinet panel. My father built that house," he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, not grief exactly, but the weight of something old that still had edges. "He built that cabinet. He knew about that panel." Charlotte said nothing. She waited. "Which means," Wade said slowly, "that either my father knew about this ledger and chose not to act on it, or someone put it there after his death and before I moved into the office." He was quiet for a moment. "My father died 4 years ago." "When did your previous housekeeper leave?" His eyes came up to hers, the same calculation happening in both of them simultaneously. "April," he said. 8 months ago." "And before her, a woman named Clara Holt. She was here for 12 years, left when my father died." He paused. "She was the one who kept these books. This is her handwriting in the first 40 pages. She documented it," Charlotte said carefully. "Someone documented it, and then hid it. And my new housekeeper found it." He looked at her steadily. "Does Langford know you're here?" The question landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripples move outward. "I don't see why he would. I'm nobody. I was a laundress in Caldwell Springs. You were a laundress who worked in a building 2 doors from his office for 14 months. Wade stood up. His voice was still quiet, but it had changed, taken on the particular quality she was beginning to recognize as Wade Harper, preparing to act rather than to think. "How often did you deliver to his office?" "Twice a week, sometimes 3 times in summer." "Did he ever speak to you?" "Twice. Once to tell me I'd left a shirt collar too stiff, once to ask me if I'd seen anyone near his office after hours." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. "What did you tell him?" Wade asked. "That I hadn't," Charlotte said. Which was true, at the time. Wade picked up the ledger from the table. "I need to get this to someone I trust in Cheyenne. A lawyer named Alderman. He's been trying to build a case against Langford for 2 years, but he's had no documentation." He looked at the ledger in his hand. "This is the documentation. What do we do in the meantime?" He looked at her. And there was a moment, one of those moments she was accumulating like pressed flowers, storing them flat and careful, and not quite examining them, where he looked at her, not as an employee or a problem to be managed, but as something that didn't have a clean name yet. "We keep working," he said. "We say nothing, and we act like everything here is exactly what it appears to be." "I'm good at that," Charlotte said. "I know," he said, and walked out. The person who arrived at Harper Ridge 2 days later was not Victor Langford. It was a man named Roy Tillman, which Charlotte knew because Pete told her, and Pete knew because he had been in Caldwell Springs the previous winter, when Tillman had nearly beaten a man to death over a card game, and had walked free because Langford's lawyer had appeared from nowhere and made it go away. Tillman worked for Langford, the way certain kinds of dogs work for certain kinds of men, not because of loyalty, but because of appetite, and because someone reliable kept the appetite fed. He arrived on a Tuesday right at the supper hour, when the hands were coming in from the range, and the bunkhouse was full of noise and motion. He tied his horse at the main post and knocked on the house door. The front door, which meant he was either bold or stupid, or instructed to present himself as something he wasn't. Charlotte answered it because she was nearest. Tillman was a compact man, weathered and flat-eyed, with a smile that sat on his face, the way paint sits on wood that hasn't been properly primed. One good rain and it peels right off. He took off his hat when she opened the door, which was a studied performance of courtesy. "Ma'am, Roy Tillman. Here to see Mr. Harper on behalf of Victor Langford. It's regarding a business proposal." "Mr. Harper is occupied," Charlotte said. "I can tell him you called." "I'll wait," Tillman said pleasantly. "It may be some time. I'm patient." The smile widened slightly, and for just a moment, one moment quick enough that she might have imagined it, his eyes moved past her into the interior of the house, scanning with the quick, professional attention of a man who was looking for something specific. Charlotte stepped into the doorway rather than back from it. A small movement, but deliberate. "I'll let him know you're here. You're welcome to wait at the bunkhouse. Pete will have supper on." Something shifted in Tillman's expression. Not much, but enough. He had expected to be invited in. "That's kind of you," he said. She closed the door, walked directly to Wade's office. "Roy Tillman is outside. He works for Langford, and he's here about a business proposal, which is almost certainly not about business." She kept her voice level. "He was trying to see inside the house." Wade was already on his feet. "How long ago?" 2 minutes. I sent him to the bunkhouse." He moved past her into the hallway, and she followed, because the ledger was in this house, and Tillman was on this property, and she was not going to stand in the kitchen and wait to find out how it went. Wade stepped out onto the front porch. Tillman had not gone to the bunkhouse. He was still standing near the post, examining the front of the house, with the casual deliberateness of a man who wasn't trying to look like he was examining anything. "Tillman," Wade said. The man turned. "Mr. Harper." "Good evening, sir. Victor Langford sends his regards." "What does Victor Langford want?" Tillman produced a folded paper from his coat. "He's interested in purchasing the eastern quarter of Harper Ridge, the section along Crane Creek. He's prepared to offer a fair price, quite generous, actually, given the current market." Wade did not take the paper. "That section isn't for sale. Mr. Langford thought you might say that, and asked me to remind you that the drought conditions last summer affected a number of operations in the county, including, if I'm not mistaken, Harper Ridge's cattle yield." Tillman said it pleasantly, like a man commenting on the weather. He thought a generous offer might be welcome given the current. "Harper Ridge's finances," Wade said, "are not Victor Langford's concern. Tell him the eastern quarter isn't for sale. Tell him no section of this ranch is for sale. And tell him that if he sends someone to my door again without prior arrangement, I'll take it as a signal that his interest in my property has moved beyond business, and I'll respond accordingly." Tillman looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Charlotte standing behind Wade's left shoulder. "You must be the new housekeeper," he said, "from Caldwell Springs." Charlotte met his eyes, said nothing. "Victor mentioned you," Tillman said conversationally. "Said you were a hard worker. Said he hoped you'd found a good position." The smile was doing something complicated now. It was still there, still arranged correctly on his face, but behind it was something else that Charlotte recognized, with the old animal certainty of someone who had spent years learning to read which kind of danger was walking toward her. This was a message being delivered. "We know where you are." "Good evening, Mr. Tillman," Wade said. The man put his hat back on, tipped it to Charlotte with a courtesy that made her skin prickle. "Ma'am," and walked to his horse and rode out. Wade stood on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then he turned to Charlotte. "He came to see if you were here," she said before he could speak. "Yes." "How did Langford know to look here?" "Gus McCready," Wade said flatly. "Gus knows everyone in this county, and he has reasons to be friendly with Langford. After what happened in the saloon, it wouldn't take him long to tell Langford that I'd brought a woman from Caldwell Springs to Harper Ridge." He paused. "A woman who had spent 14 months 2 doors from Langford's office." Charlotte thought about this. The connection was thin enough that Langford might be acting on suspicion rather than certainty. He didn't know she had found anything. He didn't know what she had or hadn't seen. He was looking. He was checking. "We need to move the ledger," she said. "I already sent a copy to Alderman in Cheyenne last week," Wade said. "A writer I trust. He has the names, the contract terms, all of it." He looked at her. "The original is still in the house. If Langford is looking, then we give him something to find that isn't the ledger," Charlotte said. Wade looked at her. And this time, The thing she couldn't name in his expression was different, sharpened, engaged, the look of a man who was recalibrating what he understood about the person in front of him. "What did you have in mind?" he said. What she had in mind was simple, in the way that good solutions are always simple. In retrospect, she made a false ledger, not a complete fabrication. Enough of the original form that it would look right at a glance, supply records, wage figures, the standard accounting of a working ranch, but with the names of the families replaced by common surnames and the contract language amended to read as normal purchase agreements. She spent 2 evenings on it, working after the main house was quiet, writing in a hand as close to Clara Holt's original careful script as she could manage. She was a good forger. She had not known that about herself until this moment. But it turned out that 14 months of copying laundry lists and supply orders in rooming houses where your client's handwriting was the law had taught her more than she'd realized. Wade appeared in the kitchen doorway the second evening and watched her for a moment. She didn't look up. "You knew Clara Holt's handwriting well enough to replicate it," he said. "I've spent 2 days practicing." She dipped the pen, kept writing. She had a particular way with the letter G. The tail comes down and then curves back left instead of right. Took me a while to get it consistent. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, watching her work. She was aware of him, watching the way you're aware of sunlight on your arm, not uncomfortable but present, and with a warmth that you don't quite acknowledge. "You're good at this," he said. "Being useful is the only reliable form of safety I know," she said, and then regretted it slightly because it was more honest than she intended. He was quiet for a moment. "That's not how it should be," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it's how it is." Another pause. The fire in the wood stove settled. Outside, a night bird called once and went silent. "My wife used to sit at this table," he said. Charlotte's pen stopped. She kept her eyes on the page. "She died 6 years ago," he said. "Fever. It took 3 days." He said it the way you say something you have said so many times in your own head that the words have worn smooth, have lost their roughest edges, but not their weight. "I kept this ranch because it was the thing she believed in, the thing we built together. After she was gone." He stopped, started again. "After she was gone, I kept everything exactly as it was, because changing anything felt like losing her again." Charlotte set down the pen. She looked at him. He was not a man who spoke about this. She understood that immediately, with the instinct she had developed for reading people who had learned to keep their inner lives armored and careful. He was telling her because something had unlocked it. She didn't know yet what. "What was her name?" she asked. "Sarah," he said. "She sounds like someone who knew the value of a good table," Charlotte said. Something happened on Wade Harper's face that she had not seen there before. Not the near smile she'd cataloged from their first days together. Something fuller. Something that was still grief, but was somehow also at the same time something else. "She did," he said. "She absolutely did." He stood up then, as though the moment had reached its natural completion, and extending it would cost more than he was prepared to spend. "The ledger," he said, returning to the practical. "When you finish the copy, I'll keep it in the cabinet where anyone looking would expect to find something. The original goes with me tomorrow. I'm writing to Cheyenne, to Alderman, and to 3 other men who I trust and who have the standing to put pressure on the territorial governor's office, if Langford moves against the ranch while I'm gone." "He won't," Charlotte said. "Not openly. He doesn't know yet whether he has a reason to. And if he decides he does..." She looked at him steadily. "I've been handling situations I wasn't equipped for my entire life, Mr. Harper. I'll manage 3 days." He nodded, the small final nod that closed things. "I'll leave at first light. I'll be back Thursday." He left. She picked up the pen and went back to work. But her hand was less steady than it had been, and she made herself breathe carefully and evenly until it steadied again, and she did not let herself think about a woman named Sarah, who had once believed in this ranch, and this table, and this kitchen. And she absolutely did not let herself think about what it meant that Wade Harper had told her. "I was back on Wednesday. Not Thursday. Wednesday a full day early, and he came in fast with the black horse lathered, and his jaw set in that particular way she had learned meant something had gone wrong. "Alderman is dead," he said. "Found in his office Monday morning. They're calling it a heart attack." Charlotte went very still. "How is 51 years old?" Wade said. "Healthy man, never sick a day according to his clerk." He hung his hat. "The copies I sent him, the papers he had, his office was searched the night before his body was found. His clerk told me in confidence because he doesn't know who else to trust. Everything was taken." "So Langford knows someone was building a case," Charlotte said slowly. "And he's moved to close it." Wade looked at her. "Which means he's no longer checking, he's acting." The weight of what that meant settled over the kitchen like weather. "The original ledger," she said, "is safe. I left it with a man in Cheyenne who Langford doesn't know I'm connected to." He paused. "But Charlotte," and he stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name, not Miss Bennett. Charlotte. She noticed it the way you notice a change in temperature immediately, involuntarily, with your whole body, before your mind has processed it. "He knows you're here," Wade said. "And now he knows something is moving against him. He'll start pulling threads, and you're a thread." "I know," she said. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," he said. And the way he said it was not like a promise made to an employee or a person under his protection out of obligation. It was the way you say something when the saying of it costs you something real, when the words require you to admit something you have been carefully not admitting. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "I know that too," she said. And neither of them said anything else. But the kitchen that evening was different from all the kitchens that had come before. It charged with something unspoken and enormous that neither of them was ready to name, and that the world outside the window, dark and wide and entirely indifferent, was about to force into the open, whether they were ready or not. The rumors reached Caldwell Springs before the week was out. Charlotte heard them from Nell Baxter, the dry goods merchant's wife, who came to Harper Ridge on a Thursday to collect a debt. Wade's previous supplier had left unpaid and stayed 40 minutes longer than necessary because Nell Baxter was the kind of woman who gathered information the way other women gathered embroidery thread compulsively, without quite realizing she was doing it, and with a vague sense that it would all be useful someday. "People are talking," Nell said, accepting the coffee Charlotte had poured because refusing it would have been rude, and Nell was not rude, only relentless. "About you, about this arrangement." "People talk about everything in a town that size," Charlotte said. She kept her voice easy and her hands busy with the morning biscuits, because idle hands during an uncomfortable conversation were a form of confession. "They're saying you manipulated Wade Harper." Nell watched her carefully. "That you found out he had money and engineered that business with Gus McCready to get yourself onto this property." Charlotte put the biscuits in the oven, closed the door, turned around. "Is that what they're saying?" "Victor Langford is saying it." Nell corrected herself with a small precision that told Charlotte the woman was sharper than she looked. "He told 3 people last week, and those 3 people each told 4 more, and that's how Caldwell Springs works, as you probably know." She paused. "I'm not telling you because I believe it. I'm telling you because you should know it's moving." Charlotte looked at her for a moment. Nell Baxter was somewhere in her mid-40s, with the careful eyes of a woman who had learned to watch the room rather than perform for it. She had been married to the same man for 22 years. She knew things. "Why are you telling me?" Charlotte asked. "Because Clara Holt was my cousin," Nell said simply. "And Clara left this ranch frightened of something she wouldn't name. And 6 months later, she was dead of a fever that came on very sudden for a woman who'd never been sick." She set her coffee cup down on the table with a small, deliberate click. "So I watch what happens around Victor Langford's business very carefully. And right now what's happening is that he's trying to discredit you before you can do anything that inconveniences him." The kitchen was very quiet. "Clara Holt," Charlotte said. "She kept the ranch accounts. For 12 years. And she left suddenly when Wade's father died. 3 days after the funeral," Nell said. "Packed 1 bag and was gone before sunrise. I got 1 letter from her from Denver that said she was safe and that some things were better left alone." Her eyes held Charlotte steadily. "Then nothing. Then a letter from a boarding house in Colorado saying she'd passed." Charlotte sat down at the kitchen table. The biscuits were in the oven. She had maybe 12 minutes before they needed to come out. "The ledger," she said carefully. "Not a question. Not quite a statement." Nell Baxter went very still. "What ledger?" "Clara's ledger, the one she kept." Charlotte watched the older woman's face move through several things quickly. She documented it, didn't she? What Langford was doing. And then she hid it, and she ran because she knew what would happen if she stayed. Nell was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the fire in the wood stove shifted and settled. "She wrote to me once," Nell said finally. "Before the Denver letter. She said she had made sure the truth was somewhere safe. She said that when the time came, someone with sense would find it." She looked at Charlotte. "She didn't tell me where. She was protecting me." "She was protecting everyone she could," Charlotte said. Something moved across Nell Baxter's face. Grief and anger combined in the proportion that produces the clearest kind of determination. "What do you need?" she asked. "Names," Charlotte said. "Anyone in this county who lost land to Langford in the last 10 years and is still here and still angry enough to testify." Nell nodded slowly. "I can do that." Quietly. "I've been doing things quietly for 22 years, Nell said. "I'm very good at it." She left 20 minutes later with the debt settled and nothing visibly different about her departure. But Charlotte watched her go with the first thing she had felt in 4 days that wasn't fear. Something sharper and cleaner, and considerably more useful. Wade came home that evening to find Charlotte at the kitchen table with a list of 11 names written in her careful hand. He read it standing up. His expression went through several things. "How did you get these?" he asked. "Nell Baxter." He looked up. "Clara Holt's cousin. She's been watching Langford for years. She knows who he hurt and who's left standing and who might be willing to say so in front of someone official." Charlotte leaned forward. "Wade, Clara documented this because she knew it mattered. She hid it here because she trusted this ranch. She died for it. That means something." He set the list down. "If we move on this now without Alderman, without a legal framework, Alderman is gone and his replacement hasn't been named yet, and Langford knows he has a window," Charlotte said. "He's not going to wait for us to get organized. He's already moving the rumors, the pressure on the suppliers, whatever he said to Gus McCready before Tillman showed up here. He's building a case against this ranch and against me personally, and if we sit still and wait for the perfect moment, it won't come." Wade looked at her. He had that look again, the recalibrating look, the one that meant he was updating his understanding of something. "You're right," he said. "I know." Something close to a smile. "You always know." "Not always," she said honestly. "But about this." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, and they spent the next 2 hours going through the list of names who had land, who had lost it, who had documentation of the original transactions, who could be trusted to hold their nerve if Langford came at them directly. It was the most they had ever talked at one sitting, and it was purely tactical, and Charlotte was aware the entire time of something running underneath the tactics, like a current under ice, something that had been building since the night he told her Sarah's name, and that was getting harder to keep track of separately from everything else. At 10 o'clock he looked up from the papers and said, "You should eat something. You haven't since noon." "Neither have you." "I'm used to it." "That's not a virtue," she said, and got up and put together a late supper from what was left in the pantry, and they ate at the same table with the papers pushed to one side, and it felt for 20 minutes in the quiet of the late evening like something entirely other than what it was. She didn't let herself think about that. The first direct blow came on a Monday. The lumber supplier from Laramie sent a letter canceling Harper Ridge's account. No explanation given, which was explanation enough. Wade read it at breakfast and set it aside without comment, but Charlotte saw his jaw tighten in the way it did when something cost him more than he wanted to show. The second blow came Wednesday. One of the 3 ranchers Wade had spoken to in Cheyenne, a man named Hollis, who ran cattle north of the Platte, sent word through a mutual contact that he was withdrawing from any involvement. The message was 3 sentences long, and the third sentence read, "I have a family to consider." "Langford threatened him," Charlotte said. "Or paid him," Wade said. "With Langford it's hard to tell which." "How many do we still have?" 2 men who are willing to be named, 3 who will support behind the scenes. He set the letter down. It's not enough for the territorial governor's office. They need visible, credible witnesses, or they won't touch a man with Langford's connections. Then we need more names from Nell's list. Some of those people haven't spoken up in years. They're frightened. They're frightened because they think they're alone, Charlotte said. If they knew other people were standing up, they don't know yet. Then we tell them. He looked at her. You want to go to them directly. I want to go to the women, she said. The widows on that list. The wives of the men who lost their claims. Women talk to me differently than they'll talk to you. Not because you're untrustworthy, but because I know what it is to have nothing and be frightened and need to believe that someone else understands that before you'll risk anything. She held his gaze. Let me go to them. The silence that followed was the longest he had made her wait for an answer. She could see him working through it, the risk, the logic, the thing underneath the logic that had to do with something other than strategy. Not alone, he said. I wasn't planning to go alone. I was planning to take Nell Baxter, who they already trust, and your best horse, which they'll notice, and a list of what we already have documented, which they need to see. When? Thursday, she said. While you meet with the 2 ranchers who are still standing. He nodded, the small final nod. Thursday. She went to 4 women in 3 days. The first was a widow named Agnes Cormack, who had lost her husband's land claim to a Langford contract clause 3 years ago, and was now living in 2 rooms above a blacksmith shop in a town 12 miles east. Agnes was 60 dry, suspicious, and sharp as a honed blade. She listened to Charlotte and Nell for 40 minutes without saying a word, and then she said, Clara Holt told me this day would come. And she opened a drawer and took out a bundle of papers tied with kitchen string, and she set them on the table, and Charlotte felt something move in her chest that she recognized after a moment as the particular emotion of watching a dead woman's foresight prove itself right. She came to see me, Agnes said. 3 weeks before she left Harper Ridge. She told me to keep everything. Every original document, every receipt, every letter. She said someone would come eventually who could do something with it. She looked at Charlotte with old, careful eyes. You're that someone? I'm trying to be, Charlotte said. Good enough, Agnes said, and pushed the papers across the table. The second woman was a harder. A younger widow, barely 30, with 3 children, and a ferocity born of desperation that came out sideways as hostility. She didn't want to talk. She didn't want to remember. She had moved on. She said she had built something new. She wasn't going to put her children at risk for a legal case that would probably go nowhere because men like Langford didn't go to prison, they went to dinner parties. Charlotte let her talk. Let her say all of it. And then she said quietly, You're right that it might not work. But Clara Holt kept records for 12 years because she believed it would matter eventually. And she's gone now, and the records are still here. And the only question is whether we're the people who are going to do something with them, or the people who decided it was too hard. The young woman, her name was Martha, looked at her for a long time. If this goes wrong, Martha said, if Langford comes after my family. I won't pretend that's impossible, Charlotte said. I'll only tell you that Wade Harper's ranch and his name will stand in front of you, and I'll stand in front of you, and I don't plan to lose. Martha got up and went into the back room. She came back with a cloth-wrapped bundle that had been sewn shut, the kind of stitching you use when you intend something to wait a long time. Clara sent this to me 3 years ago, she said. I never opened it. I was too scared. Charlotte took it carefully with both hands. She was back at Harper Ridge by Thursday Evening Road. Dusty and tired in the deep way that meant she had been running on determination for 36 hours, and Wade met her at the barn because he had been watching the road for the last hour, which she knew and did not comment on. He took one look at her face and said, How did it go? We have Agnes Cormack's original documents, Martha Reed's sealed package from Clara, and 2 other women who will speak to a federal investigator if we can get one here without going through the territorial office. She handed him the saddlebag. We have enough, Wade. We have what we need. He took the bag. But he was looking at her, not the bag. looking at her the way he had started doing in the last 2 weeks, with the full, unguarded attention of a man who had stopped trying to look away. "You're exhausted," he said. "I'm fine." "You've said that every time something difficult happens." "Because it's always true, Charlotte." He said it quietly, and it was the same as the first time, her name in his voice with that particular weight to it. "You don't have to be fine, not here, not with me." She stopped. The honest truth was that she was so tired that her legs were thinking about giving out, and the 4 conversations with 4 frightened women had cost her something she didn't have a word for yet. Not just energy, but the specific effort of making other people believe something was possible when you were working hard yourself to stay convinced of it. She looked at him, and she was too tired to maintain the careful architecture of distance she had been building for 2 months, too tired to manage what she let show and what she kept back. "I'm scared," she said. It came out steadier than she expected. "I know what I said to those women about standing in front of them, and I meant it. But Langford is more powerful than anything I've handled before, and Alderman is dead, and I found a ledger in your house that someone died for, and I'm—" She stopped, started again. "I'm scared." Wade set the saddlebag down on the fence post. He crossed the 3 feet between them, and he put his hands on her shoulders, both of them a steadying grip, the kind that says "I have you" without making it about anything other than that. "I know," he said. "I'm scared too." "You don't look scared." "I've had more practice not showing it." He looked at her steadily. "But you're not alone in this. I need you to understand that." "I understand it," she said. "I'm just not very good at believing things I haven't had evidence for yet." Something moved across his face, recognition maybe, and something that was almost pain. "I know that feeling," he said. "I've lived inside it for 6 years." She looked at him. He looked at her. The barn behind them, and the dark sky above, and the whole wide and different territory around them. "We're going to win this," he said, not as a performance, as a decision. "Yes," she said. "We are." He released her shoulders, picked up the saddlebag. They walked back to the house together without speaking, and the silence between them was the particular kind that exists between 2 people who have said something important without using quite the right words, and who both know it and who are choosing for now to leave it where it is. They were 20 feet from the front door when Pete came running from the direction of the bunkhouse, and his face was wrong, pale and tight with the kind of urgency that meant something had already happened. "Mr. Harper," he said. He was breathing hard. "2 of the hands came back from town an hour ago. They said Langford is calling in favors at the Cattlemen's Association. He's filed a complaint claiming Harper Ridge has been operating with fraudulent accounts. He wants an audit." He stopped. "And he wants it done by auditors he names himself." The 3 of them stood in the dark. "He's making his move," Wade said. "Before we make ours," Charlotte said. "That means he knows we have something," Wade said. He looked at her. "Someone on that list talked, one of the women we visited." "Or someone who saw us visiting," Charlotte said quickly, because she would not let doubt land on Agnes or Martha before she had reason. "We were visible. We were traveling. Anyone could have reported it." "It doesn't matter how," Wade said. "What matters is the timeline has changed. We have days, not weeks." Charlotte thought of the sealed package from Clara Holt, the one Martha had kept sewn shut for 3 years. She had opened it in the saddle on the ride home carefully in fading light, and she had read enough of it to understand that Clara had not just kept records. Clara had written names, not just victims. Names of men Langford had paid. Men in official positions. Men who wore badges and carried the kind of authority that made accusations go sideways. She had not told Wade yet. She had been waiting to be sure she understood it fully. She understood it now. "There's something else," she said. "In Clara's package. There are names of officials Langford controls. A county judge. 2 members of the Cattlemen's Association Board." She paused. "And a deputy territorial marshal." The silence that followed was the longest and heaviest yet. "Which means," Wade said slowly, "that if we go through official channels without knowing who's compromised, we hand him the evidence ourselves," Charlotte said, "and we never see it again." Pete stood very still between them, understanding exactly enough of what was being said to look frightened. Wade turned to Charlotte. His voice was very quiet and very certain. "Tell me everything that was in that package," he said. "Every name, every figure, every word." "All right," she said, and they went inside, and the door closed behind them, and out in the dark. Wyoming night, somewhere between Caldwell Springs and the eastern fence line of Harper Ridge. A rider who had been paid to watch the road turned his horse around and rode back to report that the woman from Caldwell Springs was home. They worked through the night. Charlotte laid everything on the kitchen table. Clara's package, the names, the figures, the careful documentation of payments made to men who wore official authority like a coat they'd bought with someone else's money. Wade sat across from her, and they went through it piece by piece, and Pete stood in the doorway for a while, and then quietly made coffee because it was the most useful thing available to him, and he was a man who defaulted to usefulness when everything else felt out of his control. The deputy marshal's name was a man called Greer. He had been collecting from Langford for 4 years, according to Clara's records. Not large amounts, not the kind of money that would make a man rich, but the kind that accumulated into dependency, into obligation, into the particular trap that men like Langford built so carefully around the people they needed. Small enough to say yes to once, large enough to make saying no later feel impossible. The county judge was named Beaumont. His was worse. Clara had documented 3 separate instances where land disputes involving Langford's contracts had come before his court and been decided in Langford's favor within 48 hours of financial transfers that the records described only as consulting fees, which was the word that men used when they needed something to look like something else in writing. "We can't go to Greer," Wade said. "We can't go to Beaumont. We can't go to the territorial marshal's office without knowing who Greer answers to there." He looked at the list of names. "Who does that leave us?" "The Federal Land Office," Charlotte said. "It bypasses the territorial chain entirely. If Langford's fraud involves federal land grants, and it does, at least 6 of the claims in Clara's records were federal homestead grants, then it's federal jurisdiction. The nearest federal land office is in Cheyenne. Then someone needs to go to Cheyenne." They looked at each other across the table. "Not you," Wade said. "He knows you have something. If you leave this ranch right now—" "I know," she said. "I wasn't suggesting me. I can't go either. If I leave Harper Ridge while Langford is pushing for an audit, it looks like flight. It gives him grounds to move faster." He was quiet for a moment. "It has to be someone Langford doesn't know is connected to this." "Nell Baxter," Charlotte said immediately. "She's a dry goods merchant's wife. She's Clara Holt's cousin, who has been watching Victor Langford for 6 years, and who is considerably more capable than anyone in this county gives her credit for." Charlotte held his gaze. "She knows what she's carrying. She knows what it means. And Langford has no reason to watch a woman who goes to Cheyenne twice a year to buy fabric." Wade thought about it. Not long he had learned in the past weeks to trust Charlotte's read on people, and she had not been wrong yet. "I'll send 2 of my men with her, men I trust. They'll travel separately, not together, so it doesn't look like an escort." "Good," Charlotte said. "I went out to find the men." Charlotte stayed at the table, and in the silence of the empty kitchen, she let herself be still for the first time in 18 hours, and felt the full weight of what they were carrying pressed down on her shoulders and her chest. She breathed through it. Not because she wasn't afraid, she was afraid clearly and completely, with the sharp-edged fear that comes from knowing exactly what you're afraid of. But because the fear had a shape now, and things with shapes could be managed. Pete refilled her coffee without being asked. "You all right, Miss Bennett?" "Getting there," she said. He nodded. "Set the pot down." "For what it's worth," he said quietly. "In the 12 years I've cooked on this ranch, I've never seen Mr. Harper trust anyone the way he trusts you. Man doesn't do that easy. Doesn't do it at all, mostly." He paused. "Just thought you should know." She looked at him. Pete was 63, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something that looked like permanent calm. He had cooked 3 meals a day for 15 men for over a decade. He had watched Wade grieve and close himself off and build his silence around him like a wall, and he had kept cooking and said nothing because that was what Pete did. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged it off and went back to the stove, and Charlotte wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and held it the way you hold something warm when the world outside is cold. Nell Baxter left for Cheyenne. The next morning at first light, traveling in her own wagon with her husband's account books and a bolt of fabric samples visible in the back, because the best cover was always the truth with a layer of ordinary on top. She had listened to Charlotte's full briefing the previous evening without interrupting, and when Charlotte finished, Nell had said simply, "Clara would have liked you," and then named the specific federal land officer in Cheyenne she intended to contact because of course she already knew who he was. She had been preparing for this longer than any of them. The two Harper hands left an hour after Nell by different roads. And then the ranch went quiet, and Charlotte and Wade were left with the particular tension of people who have set something in motion and must now wait to see where it lands. The audit notice arrived that same afternoon. It was official Cattlemen's Association letterhead, 2 signatures requesting access to Harper Ridge accounts within 72 hours. The auditors named were both men who had done work for Langford before, which was information Wade had from a rancher who had dealt with them previously and lost a grazing dispute he should have won. 72 hours, Wade said. He's pushing the timeline because he knows something is moving, Charlotte said. He doesn't know what, but he knows it's now or never. The accounts are in order, Wade said. The real accounts. Whatever they look for, they won't find fraud on my side. That's not the point, Charlotte said carefully. They're not coming to find fraud. They're coming to manufacture a delay. To tie up the ranch in proceedings long enough for Langford to discredit everything we have before Nell reaches Cheyenne. He looked at her, understanding what she was saying and not liking it with a visible contained anger that was far more dangerous than the loud kind. We need to stall them, she said. Legally, within the rules but long enough. How? Your lawyer, is he in Cheyenne? Laramie. Closer. Get him here by tomorrow evening and have him file a procedural objection to the auditor's appointment. It won't hold forever, but it buys us 36 hours. She paused. That's all we need. Wade was already on his feet and moving toward the door to send a rider. The rider who went for the lawyer passed without either knowing it, the man Langford had stationed on the road. Charlotte didn't know that yet. She found out later in the accounting of how things had gone wrong that Langford had 2 men watching the ranch's 2 access roads from positions a mile out, not close enough to be noticed, close enough to report. And when the rider went east toward Laramie, that report went south to Caldwell Springs, and within 4 hours, Victor Langford had made a decision. He had been patient for 3 weeks. He had tried the subtle approach, the rumors, the audit, the supplier pressure. And it hadn't been enough because Wade Harper was stubborn, and the woman he'd brought into his house was smarter than Langford had anticipated. So Langford shifted from subtle to direct, which was what men like him did when patience ran out and the window started closing. Charlotte was alone in the house when it happened. Wade had ridden out to the north pasture to deal with a fence situation, legitimate, necessary, the kind of thing that couldn't wait. Pete was in the bunkhouse. Most of the hands were on the range. It was the quietest the ranch got during daylight hours, and whoever had been watching knew it, and the timing was not a coincidence. She heard the horses, 2 of them, coming fast, and then stopping fast. The particular sound of horses pulled up sharply by men who don't want to announce themselves until they're already at the door. She had the kitchen knife in her hand before she consciously decided to pick it up. Old reflex. 28 years of learning to be fast. The knock on the door was hard and flat, the kind of knock that isn't asking. She went to the window first. 2 men she didn't know. Not Tillman this time. Different men, harder looking, the kind that Langford kept for the work he didn't want traced back through someone with a name and a face people remembered. She did not open the door. Miss Bennett. The voice through the door was almost pleasant. Mr. Langford would like a word, in person. He's waiting in town, and he'd like you to come with us. Mr. Harper isn't home, she said through the closed door. You'll need to come back. This isn't about Mr. Harper, the voice said. It's about you. About some property that might belong to Mr. Langford that found its way to this ranch. He's willing to be reasonable. He just wants to talk. She looked at the knife in her hand, looked at the back door. Calculated the distance to the bunkhouse against the distance between those men and the side of the house if she ran. She didn't run. Running was what they were expecting. Running meant being caught in the open away from the house, away from any witness. "I'll need to leave a note for Mr. Harper," she said through the door, stalling, thinking. "Of course," the voice said. Very pleasant. She went to the kitchen table, and she wrote the fastest note of her life. Not to Wade, but addressed to Pete's name, because Pete would check the kitchen before anywhere else. And she wrote 3 words that she knew Pete would understand because she had told him the previous week in a different context. Langford. East Road. She tucked it under the coffee pot where it would be found by someone looking and not by someone glancing. Then she opened the front door. There were 3 men, not 2. The third had come around from the side of the house while she was writing. "Miss Bennett," the first man said. He had a civil face, the kind you didn't remember afterward. "Appreciate your cooperation." She looked at all 3 of them, assessed. "I'd like to tell the cook I'm going out," she said. "We're in a bit of a hurry," the man said. Still pleasant. His hand was near his coat in the particular way that wasn't accidental. She went with them. Because she was one woman with a kitchen knife and 3 armed men was not arithmetic that worked in her favor, and because the note was under the coffee pot, and because Pete checked the kitchen every hour for the coffee that Wade drank continuously through the afternoon, and because she was afraid, but she was also thinking, and as long as she was thinking, she had options. They put her on a horse. They had brought a 3rd one, which meant this had been planned, and they rode east, not south toward Caldwell Springs. East toward the mining district, toward the abandoned claims that dotted the hills beyond the county's organized territory. She memorized the route. Every turn, every landmark she could identify by feel and sound, and the angle of the sun on her face. She stored it all in the back of her mind, where she kept the things that needed to be retrievable under pressure. Pete found the note 12 minutes after Charlotte left. He stood in the kitchen holding it for approximately 4 seconds. Then he walked out of the bunkhouse at a pace that was slightly faster than his normal walk and slightly slower than a run, because running caused panic, and panic was contagious, and he needed the 3 hands still on the property, moving quickly and quietly, not loudly. He sent the fastest rider for the north pasture for Wade and told him to ride like the ground was on fire. He sent the 2nd man to intercept the east road and watch for tracks. He kept the 3rd with him because somebody had to stay, and because Pete was 63 years old and had ridden hard country for 40 years and was not going to be left behind. Wade was back at the ranch in 18 minutes. Pete had seen Wade Harper in many states over 12 years, grieving, furious, exhausted, coldly determined. He had never seen this. This was something that didn't have a clean name. This was a man arriving at the full understanding of what he stood to lose, and the understanding hitting him not like a realization, but like a physical blow. "How long ago?" Wade said. His voice was level. His face was not. "Maybe 30 minutes, Pete said. "East Road. Tracks confirm it." 2 miles out they turned north, toward the mining district. Wade was already at the barn. "Get me 4 men," he said. "The ones who can ride and who don't talk after." "Already told them," Pete said. "They're saddling." Wade turned to look at him. Something moved in the older man's face, a recognition, a gratitude, something that was too large for the moment to contain. "She left the note for you," Wade said. "Not for me. She knew I'd find it faster," Pete said simply. "Smart woman." "Yes," Wade said. "She is." And something in the way he said it, 2 words quiet and absolute, stripped of everything except what they actually meant, told Pete everything he needed to know about what had changed at Harper Ridge in the past 2 months, and he felt simultaneously glad of it and aware that now was a very bad time for it. Victor Langford was at the abandoned Heller mine waiting. He was a tall man, which surprised Charlotte when she saw him in person. She had constructed a smaller man from his reputation, the way you sometimes do with people who operate primarily through intermediaries. He was well dressed even here in a building that had not been a functioning operation in 6 years, because men like Langford understood that appearance was itself a form of power, and never let it slip, even when there was no one worth impressing watching. He had 2 more men inside. 5 total. A lawyer whose presence was meant to make this look like a conversation rather than what it was. "Miss Bennett," he said. He had a courteous voice, measured and unhurried. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't have much choice," she said, a slight inclination of his head, acknowledging this without being troubled by it. "I'll be direct. You have documentation that belongs to me. Records that were taken from my office years ago by a woman who had no legal right to them. I'd like them back, and I'm prepared to compensate you generously for their return." "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. "Miss Bennett." His voice remained pleasant. "You were in Caldwell Springs for 14 months. You worked 2 doors from my office. You delivered laundry twice weekly to a building where I conducted sensitive business. You are now employed by the one rancher in this territory who has the standing and the resources to challenge my operations." He looked at her with the particular patience of a man who has never had to wait for anything and finds the experience mildly interesting. The coincidences accumulate past the point of credibility. "What do you want?" Charlotte said. Directly, because directness was the right tool here, he respected calculation, and she was not going to give him the performance of someone frightened into carelessness. "The ledger," he said, "and the package Clara Holt distributed before she left. I know she sent materials to several people. I want to know who has what, and I want it all returned." He paused. "In exchange, the audit against Harper Ridge disappears. The rumors stop. You receive enough money to go wherever you choose and live comfortably. And Wade Harper keeps his ranch without further trouble from me." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "And if I say no, then Wade Harper loses his ranch to an audit that will take 18 months and cost him everything he has in legal fees and frozen accounts regardless of the outcome." Langford said it the way you describe weather, factually, without malice, as if the destruction of a man's life's work was simply a condition of the atmosphere. "And you go back to being the woman nobody chooses in a town where Gus McCready's version of events is the one people have heard." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm offering you a way out, Miss Bennett. I'd encourage you to take it." She looked at him, looked at the lawyer with his careful face, looked at the men stationed at the doors. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course," Langford said. "Take a few minutes." He walked to the far side of them to give her the appearance of privacy, which was a performance they were both aware of, and Charlotte stood very still and thought with the concentrated clarity of someone who has no margin for error. She had 3 things working for her. First, the original ledger was not at Harper Ridge. It was in Cheyenne with a man Langford didn't know about. Second, Nell Baxter was on a road to the federal land office with copies of everything, and Langford didn't know that either. Third, she had left a note that Pete had found, and Pete had sent for Wade, and Wade was coming. She didn't know how long she had. She didn't know if it was enough. But she knew that every minute she kept Langford in this room waiting for an answer was a minute that worked against him and toward her. "I have a question," she said. Langford turned. "Clara Holt. What happened to her?" Something moved in his face very fast, very controlled, but she caught it. "She died of a fever in Denver, a natural death." "Of course," Charlotte said. He looked at her steadily. "Have you reached a decision?" "Almost," she said. The sound of horses reached them from outside, multiple horses moving fast, pulling up hard. Langford's men at the doors went to attention simultaneously, and Langford himself turned toward the sound with the first unguarded expression she had seen on him. Not fear exactly, but the look of a man whose timeline has just been revised by someone else. The door opened. Wade Harper walked in. He did not look like a man who had ridden hard for 40 minutes. He looked like a man who had arrived precisely where he intended to be at precisely the moment he chose. 4 of his hands filed in behind him, and behind them with a timing that stopped the room completely. 2 men in federal badges who Charlotte had never seen before. Langford went very still. "These men are federal land officers from Cheyenne," Wade said. His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. "They arrived at Harper Ridge an hour ago." He looked at Langford with the gray eyes that had always said more than his words did. "Your audit notice moved up their timeline." The lawyer in the corner stood up very slowly. Charlotte looked at Wade across the room. He looked back at her, and in one long moment, everything that had been building for 2 months passed between them without a word. The fear, the relief, the thing that didn't have a name yet, but that both of them understood now with a clarity that the last 8 weeks had been constructing piece by piece without either of them quite agreeing to it. Charlotte, he said, just her name, but the way a man says the name of the thing he was most afraid of losing. I'm all right, she said. I'm fine. And this time when she said it, it was actually true. Victor Langford looked between them, and for the first time in the entire encounter, he looked like a man who understood that he had miscalculated, not tactically, not legally, but in the more fundamental way of a man who had looked at two people and seen only obstacles and had failed to understand that what he was actually looking at was something he had no instrument to measure and no strategy to defeat. One of the federal officers stepped forward. Mr. Langford, we have some questions about federal land grant transactions between 1882 and 1888. We'd appreciate your cooperation. Langford straightened his coat, looked at his lawyer, made the calculation. Of course, he said, the pleasant voice, the perfect composure. But his hands, Charlotte noticed the hands that had signed fraudulent contracts for a decade and built an empire on other people's loss. His hands were absolutely still in the deliberate way of hands that are being controlled, not hands that are naturally at rest. He was afraid, and he was very careful not to show it. And she had won. Wade crossed the room to her, stopped 2 feet away, close enough that she could see the road dust on his coat and the particular quality of relief on his face that was also something larger than relief. You left a note for Pete, he said. I knew you'd be in the north pasture and Pete checks the kitchen every hour. You counted on that. I counted on knowing the people I live with, she said, which is different from counting on luck. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that had nowhere left to hide and had stopped trying. When this is over, he said quietly, I need to say some things to you. I know, she said. I've been not saying them for a while. I know that too. Outside, the federal officers were producing documents, and Langford's lawyer was reading them with the focused attention of a man watching his options. Narrow, and 3 of Langford's hired men had made the practical decision to cooperate rather than escalate, and somewhere on a road from Cheyenne. Nell Baxter was heading home with the satisfaction of a woman who had finally done the thing she had been preparing for since the day her cousin left a frightened letter from Denver and then went silent forever. And in an abandoned mining building in the Wyoming Territory hills, Wade Harper and Charlotte Bennett stood 2 feet apart in the middle of everything falling into place, and neither of them moved, and neither of them looked away. And the thing between them that had been building since a saloon in Caldwell Springs, and a chair scraping back in a room full of men who did nothing. That thing settled into its final shape, solid and certain, and entirely real. The ride back to Harper Ridge was quieter than the ride out. Charlotte sat on the brown mare and let the motion of the horse carry her, and she did not talk, and Wade rode beside her and did not talk either. And between them, the silence was the kind that has earned itself, not empty, not heavy, but full of everything that had just happened, and everything that was about to need to be said. The federal officers had taken Langford and his lawyer into custody, pending a full investigation. The process had been surprisingly clean. Once the badges were in the room, Langford was too intelligent to make a scene that would only worsen his position, and his men were too practical to die for a man who paid them by the job, rather than by the year. The whole thing had taken less than 2 hours from the moment Wade walked through that door, and now it was late afternoon, and the Wyoming sky was doing something enormous and golden above them, and Charlotte was so tired she could feel it in her teeth. You knew the federal officers would be at the ranch, she said eventually. Not an accusation, just working it out. Nell sent word ahead, Wade said. She'd already made contact the day before she left for Cheyenne. The officer she spoke to, a man named Garrett, had been building a file on Langford independently for 8 months. He'd been waiting for someone inside the territory to come forward with documentation. He paused. When Nell arrived with what she had, Garrett moved the same day. He and his partner were already riding when I got back from the north pasture. Charlotte absorbed this. So Nell had been in contact before we even sent her. She went to Cheyenne prepared, Wade said. She knew exactly who to see and what to give them. Clara's cousin, Charlotte said quietly. Clara's cousin, he agreed. She thought about Clara Holt, who had spent 12 years documenting the truth in a careful feminine hand, and then hidden it behind a cabinet panel, and run for her life, and died in a Denver boarding house before any of it could matter. She thought about what it meant that the thing Clara had done in fear and desperation had been the seed of everything that had followed, that the ledger had waited in the dark for the right person to find it, and that the right person had turned out to be a laundress from Caldwell Springs that nobody had thought worth watching. She won, Charlotte said. Clara, she just didn't live to see it. Wade was quiet for a moment. No, he said. She didn't. And there was something in his voice that understood grief as a specific weight rather than a general condition. The grief of a man who had built his whole life around the question of whether the people you love can be honored by what you do after they're gone. They rode in silence after that, but Charlotte felt the silence differently now. Felt him differently. The 2 feet of air between their horses was charged in a way it hadn't been before, or perhaps it had always been charged, and they had simply been too busy surviving to stand still and feel it. The ranch was awake when they got back, all of it every hand. Pete at the center of the bunkhouse steps, with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the elaborate neutrality of a man trying not to look like he had been worried sick for 4 hours. Billy Crane was there, his shoulder, long-heeled, standing with 2 other young hands who had the particular posture of people who had been told to stay put, and had spent the waiting time constructing scenarios that were probably worse than reality. When Charlotte rode into the yard, Pete looked at her for a long moment. Then he uncrossed his arms. "Supper's been ready for an hour," he said. "It'll keep another 10 minutes, she said, and got down from the horse and walked over to him and did something she had not done since before her father died. She put her arms around a person because she needed to, and not because she had calculated whether it was appropriate. Pete stood very still for a moment, surprised, and then his big arms came up and he patted her back twice, with the careful awkwardness of a man who was more comfortable with horses than with tenderness, but was doing his best. "Knew you'd be fine," he said gruffly. "Knew it the whole time." "You did not," she said into his shoulder. "No," he admitted. "I absolutely did not." Billy Crane let out a breath that had apparently been held for some time. The other hands began the disorganized dispersal of people who had been holding themselves together for a collective emergency, and were now allowed to relax, which expressed itself in loud talking and the sudden need to do something physical with their hands. Wade stood back and watched all of it. And Charlotte, turning from Pete, saw him watching, saw the expression on his face that was the most unguarded she had ever seen it open in a way that the Wade Harper of 2 months ago would not have permitted in front of his own people. He looked at home. Not in the way of a man who owned the property, but in the way of a man who had remembered what home actually meant. After supper. After the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and Pete had done the dishes with the pointed deliberateness of a man making himself scarce. Charlotte was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She wasn't drinking when Wade came back in from wherever he'd been for the past hour. He sat down across from her. The same chairs, the same table, the same kitchen where they had worked through the night 2 days ago with papers spread between them and the weight of everything bearing down. But the papers were gone now. The weight was different, still present, but shifted. Changed into something that required a different kind of reckoning. "I said I needed to tell you some things," he said. "You did," she said. Howe was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the quality of his silence. "Now, the way you learn to read weather." This was the silence of a man who had the words, but was deciding which ones to lead with, which ones to trust the conversation to carry. "When Sarah died," he said, "I decided that I was done with it. With all of it, the part of living that required you to need someone. I was good at work, good at the ranch, good at being competent and productive and useful to the county and fair to my men." He paused. "I told myself that was enough. That a man could build a life on those things without the rest of it." "And," she said, "and I was wrong," he said, simply, without performance. "I have been wrong for 6 years, and I knew I was wrong for the last 8 weeks, and I have been working very hard not to admit it, because admitting it meant—" He stopped, started again. "It meant wanting something again, and I had stopped trusting myself to want things without losing them." Charlotte set her teacup down. Her hands were steady. "I know what that is," she said. I've been doing the same thing just from the other direction. You stopped wanting because you lost what you had. I stopped wanting because I'd never had it, and it seemed smarter not to need what wasn't coming. She looked at him. Two different routes to the same place. Same place? He agreed. And then a chair scraped, she said. Something moved in his face, deep and complete and entirely real. And then a chair scraped, he said. The fire in the wood stove settled. Outside the window, the Wyoming night was wide and full of stars, the kind that only appear this clearly when you're far from everything, which Harper Ridge was far from town, far from noise, far from the machinery of other people's opinions. I'm not the woman anyone would have chosen for you, Charlotte said. Not bitterly, she had spent enough of her life being bitter about that particular fact, and had recently begun to suspect that it had cost her more than it had protected her. She said it as plainly as she said everything, because plain speech was the only kind she had ever trusted. I'm poor and plain, and I've moved 10 times in 10 years, and I don't know how to be in one place long enough to— Charlotte, he said. She stopped. I did choose you, he said. I chose you in a saloon in Caldwell Springs. When I stood up from a table I had no reason to stand up from, and I have been choosing you every day since, and I would appreciate it if you would stop arguing with me about my own decisions. She stared at him. And then, because she was exhausted and relieved, and because the accumulated weight of 8 weeks of carefully managed distance had finally become more than she could maintain, she laughed. A real laugh, involuntary and undefended, the kind she had almost forgotten she was capable of. And Wade Harper smiled fully, completely, with his whole face, the way she had suspected from the very beginning he was capable of, and had been waiting to see. I'm not easy, she warned him, because honesty first always. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I will tell you when I think you're wrong, and I'm not going to stop just because. I know, he said. I'm counting on it. I've never stayed anywhere longer than 14 months. You've never had a reason to. She looked at him across the table. What are you asking me, Wade? He leaned forward, both hands flat on the table between them, and he looked at her with the gray eyes that had never been anything but honest with her, even when they were being careful. I'm asking you to stay, he said, not as my housekeeper, not as anything provisional or temporary, or with conditions either of us can walk away from easily. He paused. I'm asking you to stay as the person this place belongs to, because that's what you are. You've been what this place was missing before I understood what was missing. The kitchen was very quiet. Charlotte looked at the table between them. At his hands, large and work-worn and absolutely still in the way that hands are still when the person they belong to is not performing composure but actually has it. She thought about a woman named Sarah who had believed in this ranch and this table. She thought about Clara Holt, who had kept 12 years of careful records so that the truth would outlast the fear. She thought about 4 women who had handed her bundles of documents sewn in cloth and tied in string, trusting her with the fragile evidence of everything they had lost. She thought about a chair scraping in a saloon, about a man who stood up when no one else did. Yes, she said. It came out clean and simple, the way the most important things always do when you finally stop arguing with them. Yes, Wade. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it, covered it with his in the unhurried way of a man who has decided something and doesn't need to make a ceremony of it. They sat like that for a while in the kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke, in the house that had been empty for 6 years, on the ranch that Clara Holt had believed in and Sarah Harper had built, and Wade Harper had held together through grief and stubbornness, and the particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage, because it mostly looks like showing up every day and doing the work. Victor Langford was indicted by federal authorities 6 weeks later. The charges were extensive land fraud, contract forgery, bribery of public officials, and 3 counts related to the deaths of individuals whose testimony might have been inconvenient, of which Clara Holt's name was the first listed. Judge Beaumont resigned before the charges against him could be filed. Deputy Marshal Greer cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge, which nobody liked, but which produced enough additional testimony to ensure that Langford's empire collapsed completely and permanently. The families in Clara's ledger, the widows, the small landholders, the people who had signed contracts they didn't fully understand and lost their claims to language they couldn't parse, began a process of restitution that would take 3 years and would not make any of them whole, but would give most of them something. Agnes Cormack got her land back. Martha Reed received a settlement that let her buy a house her children grew up in. Nell Baxter was briefly famous in Caldwell Springs, which she bore with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been waiting a long time for a particular kind of vindication and found it was exactly as good as she'd expected. Gus Macready, stripped of Langford's backing and facing his own creditors, without that protection sold his operation at a significant loss and left the territory. Nobody missed him in any specific way, but several people noted his absence with something that might have been satisfaction, if they were the kind to admit to satisfaction about such things. The town meeting happened in early October, when the harvest was in, and the community had the particular expansiveness that comes after hard work completed and winter not yet arrived. It was Nell who organized it, which surprised no one who knew Nell, and it was ostensibly a gathering to discuss the formation of a county cooperative for small landholders, a practical thing, an important thing, and also a thing that gave everyone a reason to be in the same room at the same time. Wade stood at the front of the room. Charlotte sat in the second row, which was where she had placed herself deliberately, because this was his moment, and she was not going to take the front of it. But he found her eyes before he spoke the way he had begun doing in the past 6 weeks, checking that she was there, not because he doubted it, but because finding her had become the thing he did first, the way you check the compass before you go anywhere. He spoke about the cooperative. He spoke about the county's future, about what small operations needed to survive, about the infrastructure and legal structures that would make the difference between families staying and families leaving. He was clear and specific and practical the way he was always clear and specific and practical. And then he stopped, and he looked at the room, at the faces of people who had watched everything that happened over the past 2 months, who had heard the rumors that Langford had ceded, and then watched those rumors collapse under the weight of what turned out to be true. And he said something that had not been on any agenda Nell had circulated. "There's something I want to say that's not about the cooperative," he said. "This county watched a woman walk into a saloon to collect wages she'd earned, and every man in that room made a choice about what they were going to do. I made a choice that night. I've made a different one every day since." He paused. "Charlotte Bennett came to Harper Ridge because she needed work, and I needed help, and everything that's happened since the ledger, the investigation, the families who are getting their land back, this meeting, none of it happens without her. She's the smartest person I've worked with in my life, and I've worked with a lot of people." He looked directly at her. "And I want this county to know that she's staying, permanently, as my wife, if she'll still have me after I've just announced it in front of everyone before asking properly." The room went absolutely still. Charlotte felt the blood come into her face. She was aware of every eye in the room turning to her Nell Baxter, with the expression of pure composed delight. Billy Crane, and 2 other Harper Ridge hands, who had apparently known something was coming, and were trying not to look like they knew, and 40 other faces in various states of surprise and attention. She stood up. Because sitting down for this felt wrong. "I already said yes," she told the room. 2 weeks ago, in the kitchen." She looked at Wade with the level, direct gaze she'd been giving him since a saloon in Caldwell Springs. He just likes an audience for the important things. The room laughed. Real laughter, the kind that meant something, that carried relief and warmth, and the complicated pleasure of watching something turn out right, that could easily have turned out otherwise. Wade stepped down from the front of the room, crossed to her, and took her hand in the same unhurried, certain way he had at the kitchen table. No performance. No ceremony. Just the gesture of a man who has made a decision and is done qualifying it. "I do like an audience," he admitted quietly. "I know," she said. "It's one of your less obvious qualities. You're going to be cataloging my qualities for a long time. I know that too." They were married on a Saturday in November, in the Harper Ridge yard, with the mountains to the west, and every hand on the ranch present, and most of the county standing in the cold, because Nell had organized it, and when Nell organized something, people came. Agnes Cormack was there. Martha Reed drove 2 hours with her children. 4 other women from the list were in the crowd. Women who had handed Charlotte bundles of paper in back rooms and trusted her with the weight of everything they'd lost, and who were now watching the woman they'd trusted marry a man who had stood up in a saloon when everyone else stayed seated. Pete cooked the wedding supper, which took him 2 full days, and which he would later call the finest work of his career, though he said this quietly and only once. Billy Crane, whose shoulder had been the first thing Charlotte had fixed at Harper Ridge, served as one of the witnesses. He signed his name in the register with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands that they are part of a moment that will be remembered. And then he stepped back and stood very straight and blinked several times in succession for reasons he would not discuss. 1 year after a chair scraped in a saloon in Caldwell Springs. Harper Ridge Ranch was the most respected operation in the county. Not the largest, it had always been significant, but size was not what people meant when they spoke of it now. What they meant was that it was the kind of place where things were done correctly, where workers were treated fairly, where the accounts were clean, and the word of the owner meant what it said. Charlotte ran the community kitchen she had started in the spring twice weekly, open to any ranch family within 15 miles. That was having a hard month, because hard months came for everyone, and the difference between surviving them and not surviving them was usually whether anyone showed up. She ran the literacy program for the children of ranch hands because she had learned to read from her father, and she understood that there was no form of freedom more durable than the kind that lived in your own head and couldn't be taken by market conditions or bad seasons or men who wrote fraudulent contract clauses. She kept the ranch accounts. She kept them meticulously with the particular satisfaction of someone who has always been good at a thing and has finally been given the right conditions to prove it, and she stayed. Which was the thing she had never done in 10 towns over 10 years. The thing she had stopped believing was available to her. She stayed, and the staying accumulated into days, and then months, and then a life, the kind that has weight and texture and roots that go down deep enough that wind can come, and the whole thing holds. On a warm evening in the summer that followed their wedding, Charlotte was standing on the hill above the main pasture, the one that looked west, and caught the last of the light when she heard Wade's boots on the grass behind her. He stopped beside her, looked at what she was looking at, the golden spread of land that ran to the horizon, the cattle moving slow and dark in the middle distance, the sky doing something enormous and unhurried above all of it. "Do you remember," she said, "the first thing you said to me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're coming home with me tonight." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her rather than the view, the way he had taken to finding the view and then finding her instead, which she had stopped pretending not to notice. "You thought you were solving a problem," she said. "I thought I was paying a debt someone else owed," he said, "setting something right that had been made wrong." He paused. "I had no idea." "No idea what?" "That I was the one who needed to come home." He said it simply in the way of a man who has had a long time to understand something and is now sure enough of it to say it out loud. "I'd been away from myself for 6 years, keeping things running but not living in them. And then you walked into that saloon and I stood up, and I have been coming home ever since." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. The evening light was on his face, and the wind was moving the grass around them, and somewhere below, a hand was laughing about something, and the sound carried up the hill. The way sound does over open country, clean and bright and belonging to the place. "I never left," she said, and she meant it as the simple fact. It was she who had left everywhere, every town, every position, every version of her life that had not been able to hold her, had not left this, would not leave this, had found the thing that she had not known she was looking for until a chair scraped in a saloon, and a man with gray eyes decided that what was happening in the room was his business after all. Wade Harper put his arm around her shoulders, and Charlotte Bennett, who was Charlotte Harper now, which still sometimes felt like a word, in a language she was still learning to speak fluently, leaned into him, and they stood on the hill above everything they had built, and the sun went down over Wyoming in the unhurried way it always did, as though it had nowhere else to be. She had come looking for wages. She had stayed for the truth. And she had built out of a ledger in a cabinet and a note under a coffee pot, and 11 names on a piece of paper, and one man who knew how to stand up. She had built a home. Not the kind that belonged to an address or a deed or a favorable set of circumstances. The kind that lives in the choosing and the staying and the daily decision to be exactly where you are. That was the kind nobody could take from her. That was the kind that lasts.